Welcome, friends, to this pre-concert talk about Leçons de Ténèbres by François Couperin, being premiered on Saturday, March 27, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, through Christ Church Cathedral's channels and 7 p.m. Pacific through Trinity San Jose's channels. It is my absolute delight to welcome my dear friend, Julia McCray-Goldsmith, who is priest in charge at Trinity Cathedral in San Jose. Julia, it's so wonderful to see you. I'm so glad you're here.
Chris, it's a pleasure to be with you, even though I'm actually not with you, but such is the magic of Zoom.
Absolutely.
And the magic of recording that allows us to share this magnificent performance. Thank you.
Yeah. So Julia and I both served on the staff of Trinity Cathedral in Portland, Oregon, which is where we got to know each other. And Julia has remained a wonderful presence in my life and a blessing to my whole family. She was the officiant at our wedding, me and Astrid's wedding. And there's not a lot about the pandemic that I would keep, but being able to get to do joint things together. We did Christmas 1 and Christmas 2 was shared with the congregation at Trinity in San Jose. And last time I was out your way, I got to come and be in the space at Trinity, and it's been lovely to get some cross-congregational action through all of this.
Absolutely, and what one thing we share is congregations that meet in 2 different languages. But here you are, Chris, introducing a third.
That's right, yeah. So we're here to talk about Leçons de Ténèbres, which is Lessons of Ténèbres, which was set by François Couperin, who is a French Baroque composer. So why we have these talks and why Julia is here is to put this music into context. And our series has been very instrumental up to this point because of all things COVID. Singing remains a very difficult thing to do. So this is the first texted piece we've had in a while. And so while these talks have usually been talking with instrumentalists and talking about chamber music, now we have a piece that's text driven, and it's driven by the poetry from the book of Lamentations, thought to be written by the prophet Jeremiah. And I think it's slightly ironic that I've called upon one of the most joyful people I know to talk about lamentation with me. But I thought it would be great for us to explore the tradition of lamentation, the theology that we draw from Jeremiah's writing and how it relates to us today, and to talk about the context of all of that within the music that we'll hear on Saturday.
Thank you, Chris. Before we kind of launch into the music and the biblical tradition, I'm curious why you chose this and how does this connect to you personally? Sure.
So I feel like we've been in a kind of exile, an exile that Jeremiah experiences. It's interesting to me that the poetry is written from the perspective of standing outside Jerusalem. It's not like this calamity is going on around him. He's removed from it in a certain way and he's a spectator of something that has happened in the distance. And I think for a lot of us, that's how this time has felt. How much more comfortable can you be to be at home all the time? Yet we're in the middle of this collective trauma, and the idea of being exiled from the temple. For me, I think that's played out mostly in how Christ Church Cathedral has done congregational singing during this time. Alone in the cathedral, recording myself playing a hymn for no one. Hymns are not instrumental pieces, they're choral pieces, yet I'm sitting there playing the organ to an empty room. Now, eventually, through the magic of technology and hours of video editing, that becomes a congregational hymn with 4 singers. But it's this weird feeling of exile that I know I've been experienced in a musical world. What about you, Julia? How has exile, or how is this text connected with you personally during this time?
Well, before I dive into that, I actually just want to give you a nod and an affirmation. I know what you're doing because, of course, my cathedral is attempting to do similar things. And I think, particularly for musicians, this is a season of exile, possibly more than for me, although I have a similar challenge in that I preach to an empty cathedral every week, which is truly weird. But I also have a significant pastoral life outside of our recordings. And, what I hear from my folks, and certainly what I feel inside myself, is so much lament.
Mm.
And as you stated, there's a kind of exile from our buildings, which are sort of the unspoken story of our faith. They're the temple, they're all that symbolic place of meeting from God. And here we are standing outside of them. But in addition, I hear of endlessly of loss of freedom of movement and loss of relationship. You guys are probably hearing this as well in Indianapolis, but grandparents who can't see their grandchildren even when they're nearby, friendships that are kind of short-circuited, particularly amongst our folks who are less adept at technology. And of course, Chris and you and I this morning already realized we're not as adept as we think we are.
Right.
It's imperfect, and I'm glad we're carrying on. But I think we can't carry on without remembering that we are dwelling in the midst of great loss. And in addition to the pandemic, of course, we've had a year of wrestling with the sins of systemic racism, which is a source of great lament. And our African American BIPOC friends have been lamenting forever, and are kind of wondering why we haven't caught on yet. And then the other thing I'm conscious of is, we're standing outside our temples right now, but in the wake of significant climate instability, more and more people are climate refugees. So there's never been a time, honestly, when it's been more important for us as a church to revisit the tradition of biblical lament. The easy response to sorrow and loss is to get angry. And Lord knows we've seen plenty of that. But I think the biblical response gives us some healing options that are different than trolling the internet, for example, as a way of dealing with our sense of loss. Yeah, let's
Yeah.
not do that, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, Go ahead, Julia. Sorry.
Perhaps I'll just a little bit.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons I'm grateful to you, Chris, is you've given me kind of a reason to revisit this significant voice of lament in our scripture. It's a bit countercultural for North American Christians for a whole host of reasons. But I'm a morning prayer person, and consequently, I've been spending lots of time in the Psalms, and fully, I think a third of the Psalms are Psalms of various forms of lament. And it's been such a lifeline this year. No, I think you guys have a morning prayer practice at Christ Church Cathedral as well. No,
We do. Yeah.
and
we've been lucky to share that, to even grow that during this time, that tradition of keeping the office, the whole diocese through what we call the Indy Virtual Abbey keeps the office every day. And it's been a lovely rekindling of I think a personal spirituality that sometimes as Anglican can feel foreign to us.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing about the biblical literature of lament and the Psalms in the life of our cathedrals is that it's a personal spirituality that's profoundly in solidarity with people who suffer, which is something I'm really grateful for in this text from the Lamentations of Jeremiah, attributed to Jeremiah, and in our common life together. So just really quickly, I wanted to mention a few things I've been learning as I've moved through the literature of lament. Somebody described it to me as a loud religious ouch. And I think, there's the loudness for sure. We hear that in this piece of music. a kind of sense, as you've said to me, a kind of sense of chaos, and it describes a scene of chaos, right? Um, and there's certainly an ouch in no, no holds barred, but I think it's really important as we experience the music and literature of lament that it is profoundly religious, that lament is not despair. It's a prayer that comes out of pain, um, and uh, um, and it's a prayer that demands intimacy with God, and that God step up and do God's job even in the midst of disaster. We do hear that in the Lamentations of Jeremiah. However, in the words, we don't hear that in the piece that you all are going to perform for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, oh, there's just so much more I could say about this. But Chris, tell me a little bit about Couperin's piece and how it reflects lament in words or
Sure.
music.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me thinking about this biblical, this tradition of lament coming out of chaos, coming out of the chaos of seeing the destruction of Jerusalem, coming out in our experience of right now, the chaos in our world, how very highly structured both the poetry and the music is. And so in researching, well, first thing one notices in performing this piece is it's in Latin, except for the parts that aren't. So actually, let me show you the score here.
It's great.
So this is the first page of the Couperin, and so the first bit is Incipit Lamentations. So this is just announcing what we're singing here. This is introducing the Lamentations according to the prophet Jeremiah, and then Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
Right.
And why you have that is because in Hebrew, this poetry is organized by letter. So the first letter of the poetry in Hebrew is alpha. And then if we go on, the next stanza of the poetry begins with the next letter of the Hebrew language, Beth. So we're singing in Latin here, but we get these interjections of the Hebrew poetry. And the poem itself is an anacrostic, which I think I'm getting right. And if I'm not, I'll do some creative editing on the backside of this conversation. But meaning that each letter of each line starts with the next letter of the alphabet. So, and Jeremiah in the Hebrew poetry goes through every letter of the alphabet. That is something that's terribly difficult to translate into English or any other language.
Right.
It's an incredibly specific formula that he's creating something, a really beautiful artistic product out of the pain that he is experiencing, and that the whole nation of Israel is experiencing, and doing it in this highly structured and highly organized way. And then to talk about Couperin for a minute, out of a lot of chaos, there's a lot of organization. So just pulling up the score for just one other second to point out, I need to hit share. So we're looking at what's called a facsimile. So this facsimile is what Couperin would have oversaw the printing of. This was printed in the day. And by the standards of the 18th century, this is really, really specific stuff. There's no question marks about how to perform this piece. It's printed with incredible detail. For even to the extent of, you see here on page 4, petite pause. He's telling you not only to stop playing for a minute, but how long to stop playing for a minute. Just short. Don't have it be a long. These sort of stage instructions. And, what's interesting to me about this music is there's no real tune. You don't whistle something on the backside of hearing this piece. There's no refrain to come back over and over again. There's no earworm that you get. In a lot of ways, it feels like chaos the whole time. It's focusing more on the than on musical ideas. But really, things are incredibly highly structured. Even little runs. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'll move it right to the top of the page.
Yes.
Good. These little runs here, he's very, very specific about how long those should take and how those should flow. You'll hear the singers doing a lot of ornamentation. So they're adding extra notes. All of that is in the score. The X here, that means that you have a trill on that note. So what sounds very improvisatory, very free and flowing and expressive of the pain in the poetry is actually incredibly highly organized. And I think that is akin to how Jeremiah organized his text. They're going through a very specific process to express really complex emotions. And I think framing it in that way, framing it in a way that you have to create art with really strict parameters helps us to process things. Just in the same way liturgy does, I think, that we have confines on how we do things and how we move through things allows us to express our emotions in a way that I think is more focused.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of all the sort of brave and heartfelt work that's being done around trauma and healing from trauma. And of course, the literature of biblical lament is sort of rehearsing the disaster so that we can live with it and recover from it. And also hold it an arm's length from ourselves as we begin to process loss. And so I hadn't thought about this until you started talking about the highly structured music and poetry. But I think the pastoral wisdom of the author of Lamentations, Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, he saw some traumatic events in his lifetime. And I think part of the pastoral wisdom here is that he's broken it down for us. You know, they say that for folks who've experienced great trauma, they feel out of control. And that's why it keeps coming back and re-traumatizing us. But to begin to put some structure around it and say other people have been there and here's how it breaks down, and take it in the bites that you can while you find your resiliency within it, is actually pastorally really profound and rings true 600 years later.
Right. It strikes me, Julia, that that in the music, we only get the very beginning of the story. We only get the first 3 lessons. There's the first nocturne for Ténèbres, the Wednesday service in Holy Week, and the story goes on. And there's a turn in the poetry to turning to a more hopeful perspective. That poetry is not included. However, the music, I think, in the 3rd lesson, that's the duet lesson, both sopranos are singing. The music in the 3rd lesson, I think, becomes much more hopeful and incredibly beautiful, and often in the major mode. And I think that Couperin's giving away the end of the story a little bit, even though he didn't set that poetry. Some of the most gorgeous moments of anguish in terms of the text are the most beautiful musical moments. And I think there's a foreshadowing there, both to the end of the story of Jeremiah and to the end of the story of Passiontide, of resurrection on the 3rd day. And I think Couperin really moves us there, even if the poetry doesn't.
Yeah, and I do want to land quickly on the turn that happens in the 3rd chapter of Lamentation. After sort of reciting this complete devastation of Jerusalem, this abject disaster, this collective trauma, really, then Jeremiah goes and says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. And, part of me just wants to laugh and say, what the heck? What on earth is happening here? But that is classic biblical lamentation, which is both truthful and unflinching in the face of disaster, and also truthful and unflinching in naming the mercy of God. And, I think one of the beautiful things about the tradition of lament, particularly in the Hebrew scriptures, which we can carry forward into our experience of Holy Week, is to hold those two truths in tension. Like, this is a disaster. God, step up and be God. And we hear those themes in tension all throughout Holy Week. The wrestling with how devastating the situation is, and this kind of intimate prayer to God saying, this is who you are. You are merciful and good, and act that way. And, come to our aid in the midst of this disaster.
Yeah. And I think the faith that Jeremiah has that those things are true, even in the midst of evidence that seems to the contrary, to know
exactly,
with absolute certainty that God is merciful and God is loving, and that the actions of the day, the peculiarities of our time, don't and can't disprove that. It is just a fact that we have to center ourselves around.
And I think it is that rehearsing in verse, in music that we do together that makes us resilient, as the Hebrew people were resilient in the face of multiple disasters. Certainly the exile was unique in the Jewish memory. But we need both. We need honesty and we need hope. And I want to just quickly do a kind of a map of what you might find in literature of lament. Chris, you can edit this out if it's not helpful. But I'm struck that real lament, and this may account for the musical turn that we encounter in Couperin's piece, is always praise, because embedded within it is an assumption that God's character is good and that God's intention is salvific. And that never goes away, even when we rehearse the disaster again and again. There's always this assumption about God's character and God's intent, which served certainly to the resiliency of the Hebrew people, but it does to us as well. So I think it's important to remember that these grievous, disastrous texts are also a form of praise, which I think this particular piece of music really illuminates for us.
Absolutely.
Lament proves that there is relationship. Lament is it's the opposite of despair. It is an insistence on the relationship with God and love of God for us, even when circumstances looked like anything but. I also think it's interesting to reflect on how lament is our pathway back to God when we're miserable, when we're traumatized, when we're looking at a disaster. Lament, we're not going to get back to God by saying, saying prayers of thanksgiving. That's not where we'll be.
Right.
And it's not where we're going to be for a lot of this week. But lament carries us back to God in the wake of disaster. And then I also want to mention, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but lament is a form of solidarity. I think we, in this time and place, don't always love the literature of lament, because it's a little bit countercultural. We're supposed to fix stuff and make it better. And lament says, you got me here, God. This is beyond me. But it also allows us to connect with the pain of others, even if we're not feeling it ourselves. And I feel like during Holy Week, that's the biggest gift of our literature of lament is it may be that morning prayer is a personal piety, but it is actually, a collective piety as well, because it says that, together as a human race, we have experienced great loss and God is with us. I insist that God be with us.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And what better reminder that God is with us through anything that this world could throw at God than Holy Week and Easter at the end of it.
Right. And this particular piece of music, although it references an event in 580 some BC, it's so easy to transpose that onto the tragedy of Holy Week, as many people have. The temple of Jesus' body is destroyed, and yet, we reach out to God in hope
and praise. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Julia, it's been so fun to explore these texts with you. And I can't wait to premiere this concert on the 27th of March, 6:30 p.m. Eastern through Christ Church Cathedral's channels, and 7 p.m. Pacific through Trinity San Jose's channels. I hope that everyone possible will join us, share it with your friends on Facebook, or whatever social media du jour you might be experiencing. And I'm so glad that our two congregations can join together to experience this music and to start Holy Week together. And I'm so grateful to you, Julia, for your insight and your wisdom and your time to talk about all of this on the cusp of a pretty big week for all of us. So thank you from me personally and from Christ Church Cathedral, and really looking forward to this concert coming up on March 27th.
Chris, thank you. And I just love you for saying share this on all our social media. Like, we might be the only people in the world who say, come join us in deep sadness, in lament, as a social media strategy. But again, that is actually a far better thing to say than, I'm angry, I'm suffering loss, and therefore I'm gonna pummel you with words. Pummel God with words.
Absolutely.
God, come be God for us.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julia.